Let's talk about what is widely considered to be one of the greatest accomplishments of 21st century literature, an 825-page novel that is a single sentence and which is widely considered Jon Fosse's magnum opus and the reason for which he won the Nobel Prize just a couple years ago. Fosse is a Norwegian playwright and novelist. He's very prolific. I've read a few of his works before, a short story collection, as well as his little novella Alice at the Fire, which also is told in just one long flowing sentence and tells the story of a family over multiple generations weaving in and out and hopscotching through time to really show a whole varying play with geography. And I just talked about it in my recent video about books that really break with reality and will play with your mind. But this is a wholly different version of a book because it is so long and it's so much more focused and repetitive and meandering. And I really want to talk about it with somebody. So please put your comments if you've read this or similar work, because it is a very divisive but still a very interesting work. I think just as much for its flaws as for its accomplishments. The book, of course, is divided into 7 sections and was originally published in those sections. So first it was 1 and 2, and then 3 to 5, and then 6 to 7. And that is how I got the book out from the library and how I digested it, was reading those separate volumes as it goes. But each of the volumes really starts out the same. The protagonist, Asel, who's a pretty successful abstract painter in Norway, is contemplating a painting he has just made of 2 crossed lines that resemble St. Andrew's Cross. And each section also ends the same way, with Asel reciting a prayer while usually holding his rosary. In between these sections, which of course break off mid-sentence and resume in the next section, still in that same flowing sentence, we examine Asel's slow, quiet life of him just observing the same routine again and again, which is of course mirrored in these bookends. And it's this repetition, this almost very mundane and gray sort of life that is both the book's strength and I think its weakness, at least for me. Life paths are a major theme of this book, sort of how your life is going to course and what things will divert you onto a different path. Of course, this is mirrored in the shifting sentences which flow through, as well as the fjords which go all the way through Norway. So the form follows the function follows the form, and it is an interesting subject because the way that Fosse explores this is through having Asel have a doppelganger, another artist who has the same name and looks very similar to him, who's referred to later on as the namesake, who is a drunk, also an abstract painter, but his life is very different than our protagonist Asel, who was married, who is mourning his wife who has died of cancer. This namesake is a twice divorced alcoholic who has 3 kids he never sees. He dresses the same way, in all black, with his long hair tied back in a little ponytail, and he wears colorful scarves. Coincidentally, of course, Fosse has done this the same way. He is also a recovering alcoholic and he's a teetotaler, and he's also, I think, on his 3rd marriage. So we have this mirrored perspective of what life you would go with to. Is it an abstract painter who's sober, mourning a wife and childless? Is it a divorced alcoholic? Is it Fosse himself, who is a writer of almost abstract literature? This enmeshment even follows 2 names, where Asel's dead wife was named Alice, which is just an anagram of the same letters of the name. His neighbor is named Aslake, who is sort of just a blue-collar guy who helps him out on their rural, almost suburban property outside of the area. Aslik has a sister, Guro, who lives remote away, and she always gets a gift of one of Elsa's paintings during Christmas. But there is, of course, another Guro who is also a lover of our other namesake, Asel. So it just becomes this really repetitive theme of all these characters sort of interweaving. They're almost confused in names. They all have very similar routines. They don't break from them. And just which path will you choose? How is your life connected? And how does it all work out in the end? Are we all connected? And this is also connected very much to the religious theme, where there are long disquisitions on the Catholic faith and just God and the nature of life in general. In fact, our protagonist Asel's faith doesn't even seem particularly Catholic. He's more interested in the rituals because it was his wife who brought him into the faith, and he's really more interested in the Mass and the Rosary. But his faith is more about how we are all connected. Everyone is the same thing. Fosse writes in a particularly affecting section that the human being is a continuous prayer. A person is a prayer through his or her longing. And he believes that when you die, you rejoin this great pattern and become part of that. Of course, this isn't really Catholic. There isn't a really concern about the Holy Trinity, but it is an interesting contemplation, and it is really the only contemplation of Asla's life. His life is very dull and gray, and not just in the landscape, which is just basically snow and the cement of the road as he drives back and forth to his gallery in the big city. He doesn't really respond in conversations to people he's talking to. He just exists in a vast silence, mourning his wife. He does talk to a phantom of his wife every day, but it's only because he misses her. She's never really there. And so it becomes this thing where he's almost an unreactive, negative person where things just happen to him and he doesn't really have any larger thoughts other than faith and trying to rejoin his wife maybe eventually. This is the life of a man on autopilot. He essentially paints by instinct. He's never really sure what he's doing. He spends long stretches staring out at sea. And mirroring Alice at the Fire, he stares out and he sees past versions of himself and his wife when they were a young couple. He sees his family, he sees himself. And so you get the whole story of his life and what he was like growing up, as well as potentially this namesake, as well as his wife. It becomes hard to read over 800 pages because you just have this blank nullity of a protagonist. He's so incurious that when his namesake falls down drunk and he has to transport him to the hospital, he meets the other Guro who was in a relationship with this man, and she mistakes him for the namesake. But he never realizes, hey, this man that I call the namesake, who everyone comments looks like me, which I comment looks like me, this might be a case of mistaken identity. He literally just spends dozens of pages being like, what's with this weird woman? I won't ask her any questions. And so this passivity flows through everything he's doing. And it is this half-life that he lives, which really makes going through this meandering narrative of 800 pages difficult because there's nothing really to clue you into anything of going over the same routines, examining the same thoughts, going to the same gallerist, having the same conversations. He is obviously a broken man, broken by the loss of his wife. And we do get flashes of him when he actually used to make decisions and do actions when he was younger, when he decides to paint, when he decides to go to art school rather than choosing the life for him. And he does have actions, but of course we don't get any sort of transition. We get a whole perspective of him as a young boy, a really awful experience that he had with a neighborhood odd man who did things to children. We get a whole courtship with his wife where she starts to make decisions for him, but we never really get a perspective of him and his many years of marriage. We never get that break. We just see him before and after, and the rest of their marriage just becomes this void in the center of the narrative. That could be an explicit choice because it is such a painful memory for Asel, but it leaves him with a hollow at the center of his character, which might be echoed in his soul, but really finds it hard to really complete him as more than an outline of a man. And I would be more inclined to believe that was a purposeful characterization if it didn't haunt every other character in the novel. I found in Alice at the Fire, it worked because it's a very short work, so you're only getting a really quick punch at these characters. But in an 800-page novel, you're really spending a lot of time even with side characters, and none of them ever really feels like a whole person. They just feel exactly like Asel, where they're just sort of hollowed out characters going through the same routine. They don't feel like people with like embodied anything. You'll get a couple lively side characters, maybe, but even then they're just odd characters. So they, rather than feeling hollow, they just feel two-dimensional. And so this becomes very frustrating because you don't really have a substance to hold on to because everything is just this repetitive flowing routine, this grayness, this drabness, this passivity, and it's reflected in the characters, which are also seem very passive and don't really do anything. There is obviously a bleakness here, but it is a gentle bleakness. Amid the endless snow, the gray paint, the bland food, there's a recipe for great mashed parsnips, which is essentially add salt and butter, and there's fermented lutefisk. The food just really complements just how utterly dreary everything is, but it doesn't feel despairing, it just feels routine like every day. It is notable that Asel contemplates his paintings in the dark. He really believes that the darkness brings out the light, the contrast in the paintings, and I think Fosse tries to do this with the literature. Again, everything is commenting on itself. It is very metatextual, not in an especially subtle way, but I'm not convinced he really gets the blackness and the bleakness in the thoughts of suicide, in the alcoholism, in the death, to really get that contrast. So it ends up being sludgy rather than creating that contrast, which Aslo sees in his paintings. In fact, the book is so unsubtle that Aslo routinely comments that he really doesn't like painting figurative paintings. He used to paint these pretty houses, which everyone loved, but then he began painting abstractly because he felt it meant much more to the soul. And of course, Fosse is painting abstractly with his one flowing sentence and shifting everything time perspective as it goes. And so it is a commentary on itself, but I don't know if it benefits from that commentary and from that comparison. With any long work that's considered a classic, I always find myself asking, is it considered a classic just because it's long and it's challenging? I know there's a recent book that's come out called Schadenfreude, which is a translation from the German, which is also getting a lot of comparisons and hype because it's a long, intricate novel, and I'm not sure that the intricacy and the length here benefits Fosse in any way. I just find the book doesn't have anything other than hoping that the accumulation of all its detail and its routine will add to something more. However, even in translation, I do find the writing hypnotic. I find it interesting. I find it flows really well. It does get into a way where the reading actually comes easy. It isn't a particularly slow novel to read. I'm just not convinced it has anything to say. Of course, we must have all of this routine and we must get to a climax even in a meandering novel. So as Asle finally makes a break from his routine, he finally decides to visit Eslick's sister, who has collected all of his art over the years. After years of refusal, the energy intensifies. We've built on everything, all of his life, and it gets into this thing about all of life, and it becomes almost ecstatic, religiously revelatory as we get into the summation of all this work that Fosse has put together. Fosse pulls the same trick that he did at Alice at the Fire when he got to the conclusion of that short novella, where everything begins to speed up. The alternations in time and perspective, the shortness of the paragraphs, we get sentence fragments, the currents transform into a maelstrom, really. In the end, we get what we were expecting, which is a life. One that drifted, it occurred, was saved barely from boozy wasting like so many others. But Asle remains an enigma as a protagonist. He remains a hollow man, tossed on the waves, carried by people, but rarely himself, contemplating God in all things, a final release into understanding. But for all his many, many words, Asle and Fosse don't really penetrate into anything. Can the mundane, layered over and over, be made weighty, gain depth? Not for me, not with this book. So let me know if you've read this, if you got really something more out of it. I found it interesting. I found it stylistically hypnotic. Some of the currents I found interesting, but as an overall work, it felt less than the sum of its parts. And it's not really a book I would recommend, despite really loving Alice at the Fire and his short story collection. I think Fosse's probably best in small doses, and I don't think this book really qualifies as a magnum opus in anything other than length, and I continually just to be disappointed by books which are really long for the sake of being long and don't really have anything to say. If I want to read a really, really long work that's really, really good, I'll stick to Bologna. I'll talk to you soon.